Nothing has influenced the culture of New Orleans quite as much as the Atlantic slave trade. I'm here in front of St. Augustine's Church in the Tremaine neighborhood here at New Orleans. That right there, that cross, that is the tomb of the unknown slave. The chains are actually made of the anchor chains of slave ships, and some of the shackles that are hanging from it were used to bind people back during the 19th and 18th century. Now, to understand how the culture of New Orleans got going, you've got to understand the mercantile system of slavery. The French, who founded the city, and then the Spanish after them, they had a fundamental difference with the way that the Anglo-Americans did slavery, and it's a complicated issue, but basically here's what it comes down to. So the Americans, in particular, they were interested in creating a strictly racially stratified society as a means to maintain control over their slaves. They also put a cap on the number of slaves that they actually brought over from West Africa. The French and the Spanish, and I'd lump the Portuguese in there as well, didn't care quite so much about that. What they cared much more about was making as much money as quickly as possible. And again, to understand why, you've just got to look at the context here, the economics of the early modern era. Now, at least as an American, I tend to think of the sort of main slave crops being, rice during, early colonial times, then tobacco, and of course the big one, cotton. But what the French and the Spanish were cultivating here on the Gulf Coast and in the Caribbean made more money than those three crops combined, a substance that has changed all of our lives. In fact, you probably ingested it this morning. Sugarcane, which was then used to make, of course, sugar. Sugarcane was big business in the early modern era. Just to put a number on it for you, a little under 5% of slaves taken from West Africa and brought into the Western Hemisphere went to what we think of as the American South. 40% went to the Caribbean. A little over 40% went to the Portuguese colony of Brazil. And those slaves were mainly used to cultivate sugarcane. It was big money, man. Big business. And because people back in Europe couldn't stop shoving sugar into their faces, millions upon millions of people were enslaved and brought to the Americas.
Augustus, how does it make you feel to be the first golden ticket finder?
Hungry.
Basically, what this meant was that you had a huge population of slaves in these Caribbean and South American colonies that radically upset the demographics of those places. For example, Haiti, for instance, in the late 18th century. Slaves outnumbered free people in Haiti by a factor of almost 2 to 1. At that point, you just do the math, right? Look at how many of us there are. There's only one man with a whip over there. We should murder him. And it's just common sense, right? It's human nature. And the Haitian Revolution of 1791 did begin as a slave revolt. It was the only successful black slave revolt in history. And it was a democratic revolution, very much inspired by the same ideals that had inspired the American and later the French Revolution. Didn't turn out nearly as well as the American Revolution did, though. A little over 10 years later, Haiti had become a genocidal dictatorship. But that's neither here nor there. Specifically in New Orleans, what this mercantile system of slavery meant was, well, several things. First of all, when the Americans came, they were horrified by what they saw as a sort of lax and permissive sort of mixing of the races. And they would try very hard to separate the races, really up until the Civil Rights Movement. Now, the mercantile system of slavery meant that a large population of free people of color was here in New Orleans, the largest anywhere in the American South. Many of these people were of mixed race. Now, I talked about this a little bit when I talked about Marie Laveau in that video, but there was this system that these white colonists had in place called plissage, which basically was a sort of form of systemic concubinage, essentially, where these black women would be basically given as mistresses to these white boys, and sometimes they would be with them for decades, and their children could, in certain cases, actually inherit some, if not all, of this white man's wealth. Especially if their placée, their mistress, was mixed race, an eighth or a quarter African American. In that case, their son would look essentially white. And so then, perhaps if that guy, never got married, or if he didn't, to a white woman, he didn't like any of his other kids or whatever, then he would sort of, give his inheritance to his black son. Now, once, though, the black son kind of came to power, he would just sort of brush it under the rug about his mother's lineage. Oh, we don't talk about her in this house, that sort of thing. But what this sort of facilitated was that you had a lot of mixed race, free people of color during slavery operating in positions of surprising authority. I mean, doctors, lawyers, operating in service to the upper crust of the white elite. Some of them even were sort of in and amongst the white elite. Many of them were plantation owners. In fact, the man who owned the most slaves in Louisiana history was a free man of color. Now, there was also a certain amount of cultural exchange happening, and that has always happened here in New Orleans between Africans and Europeans that simply did not happen in the rest of the South because the races were kept strictly separate and because black folks were always a distinct minority to white folks. It's just not really the case down here. For example, the religion of voodoo began this way. When the slaves were brought off the boat by the French and Spanish, they would be, essentially they'd stick a gun or a metaphorical gun in their face and say, hello, you're Catholic now, you have to believe this. And they simply made the best of a bad situation. They took what they identified with about Catholicism and they mixed it in with what they knew. Another uniquely American idea that resulted from this cultural exchange initially happened in Congo Square, which is very close to where we're at right now, actually. It's just a couple blocks down that way. Now, not only would slaves go there on their day off, Sunday, because they were Catholic, to just sort of talk and, socialize, gossip, and eat or whatnot, they would also sing and they would dance and they would play music. Even after emancipation, African Americans still kept coming there to play music as sort of a form of cultural pride, and actually in many cases they still do come to Congo Square on Sunday. Sometime in the 1870s or 1880s, they got their hands on brass instruments. And when you take this highly unsyncopated style of African music and mix it in with European instrumentation, then you get jazz. Many have argued that that is America's greatest gift to the world. I would say the hot and spicy McChicken, but that's just me.